My first question, Nick, is for those who haven't read your book yet, which Conservative politician most embodies your conception of the one nation Conservative? Is it someone like Benjamin Disraeli, from whom the term one nation Conservative comes from, or someone closer to one of your political heroes like Joseph Chamberlain?
Firstly, thanks for having me. Second, thanks for the nice introductions, and congratulations on setting up the Roger Scruton Centre, because I think Roger Scruton was a really important thinker for modern conservatism, and it's right that he should be remembered, and it's right that a lot of his thinking should live on beyond him. I only actually met him once or twice, but he was a very great figure, and I think some of his writing has certainly been a big influence on some of my thinking. I'm glad you started with that question, because I always think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about the meaning of one nation. These days, it is quite often taken to mean sort of liberal conservatism. It's sometimes taken to be a kind of counter to either Eurosceptic conservatism or even Thatcherism in the 80s and 90s, when actually it is none of those things. The one nation tradition originates with Benjamin Disraeli, who in his novel Sybil talked about how England, and he always talked about England rather than Britain, was becoming two nations of rich and poor. And the Conservative Party, certainly under his leadership, made it its mission to reunite those two nations. It was about overcoming division. It was often through enabling legislation, which allowed local authorities to take the action that they needed at their local level. It was interventionist. It protected workers in the workplace against the wishes of lots of industrialists at the time. But he actually never used the phrase one nation. It was then picked up by Stanley Baldwin in the 20s, who tried to pick up on the Disraeli theme. And then after the Second World War, a very important pamphlet, while the Tories were in opposition under the Attlee government, a very important pamphlet by a group of newly elected Tory MPs was published, called One Nation. And it was about housing policy and public services, and actually there was a certain amount of industrial policy in there as well. And that pamphlet had as its contributors people from an ideological range, from Ian MacLeod on one hand to Enoch Powell on the other. And the reason all of that is important, I think, is that actually the one nation tradition, I don't think at all stands for liberal conservatism or even pro-European conservatism. It's not actually connected to a particular ideological line of thinking. It's about a statement of intent by conservatives that actually division with different kinds is bad, and that we need to try to overcome it. And I think that's why it's actually a really important intellectual tradition to now return to once again, because we live in a very divided time, we live in a divided country, and those divisions not just about rich and poor anymore, they're between regions, they're between people with accumulated wealth and no accumulated wealth, they're between the social classes, different ethnic groups and so on. And the Tory party really needs to try to find a way of addressing those divisions and trying to create a kind of national identity and set of institutions, and to revive traditions that allow us to rebuild trust in one another, because with trust comes solidarity and a willingness to be good citizens and make sacrifices for one.
Picking up on this idea of division and looking at potential solutions for it, is it possible to have a kind of unification under a coalition when you have a concept that you've defined as ultraliberalism, sowing various elements of discourse? First of all, could you describe for us a little bit about this idea of ultraliberalism that you've touched upon in your book? And then perhaps going a bit further, why is it that somewhere like the United Kingdom seems able to tackle this idea of ultraliberalism through its political institutions more effectively through things like Brexit or challenging various regulations and rules than other European countries that are still in the EU?
And then the first thing to say is, when we talk about overcoming division, it's important to remember that actually, in reality, human values and interests are incessantly in conflict. And any attempt to try to harmonise those values or to pretend that all of our interests are completely aligned tends to result in some form of authoritarian, almost tyrannical government. That's what extreme ideologies like communism and fascism do. So when we talk about overcoming division, what we really mean, I think, is that we allow a kind of pluralistic way of life, but that we maintain a sense of common identity and interest in one another, and a willingness to support one another, and a willingness to sometimes make sacrifices for one another. And that, to me, is a really important understanding for conservatives, because we're not trying to completely eradicate inequality. You know, a small amount of inequality, a certain amount of inequality is a good thing. It's a reflection of the fact that it rewards hard work, it rewards innovation, it spurs people on to achieve more. The problem is when it becomes entrenched, and that makes life difficult in terms of making a reality of equality of opportunity and things like that. And this is actually this is connected to the other part of your question. So in the book, my book is a kind of prospectus for conservatives, but it's also a quite thorough, I hope, critique of liberalism. And by that, I don't mean that it's a rejection of liberalism. It's really an attempt to save liberalism from itself. And when you talk about liberalism, you enter into this world of pain of definitions, because, you know, who isn't a liberal and so on and so on. But what I say in the book is we should think about liberalism in terms of concentric circles. So at the core, you have this kind of essential liberalism, which accepts pluralism, it accepts free markets, it accepts parliamentary democracy, checks and balances, independent courts, and so on. And actually, I think almost anybody, but apart from proper extremists, I think in Western countries agree with those principles. And I think that's something that really needs to be defended and protected. But then at the next circle, you have a kind of elite liberalism, where you have a set of beliefs that are shared by, broadly speaking, the governing classes, but also plenty of other people in elite positions. So people in government and the civil service, in parliament, at the top of the BBC, the top of universities, and so on, where, you know, they have a set of beliefs which are not very different, almost regardless of party political affinity. That's about high immigration and multiculturalism. It's about actually having a fairly lightly regulated labour market and not very much intervention in the economy. But it's not right to say that we just have this kind of elite liberal consensus and that's it, and that the people who have those views, you know, those views might differ from the views of the majority of the public, but that's not the end of the story, because then you have a sort of a next circle, which is more about a kind of ratchet effect among ultra-liberals, where you have on the left increasingly militant cultural liberals who believe in this kind of militant brand of identity politics, who are really sort of, you know, assaulting the institutions and the traditions and the symbols of national identity. They're trying to turn hierarchies on their head. Equal political rights aren't enough. You actually have to attack the kind of identity, the identities of people who've been in positions of power. And we can maybe talk about some of the intellectual origins of that line of argument later. And then on the right, you know, you have people who disagree with that ultraliberalism on the left, but on the right, you have a kind of ultraliberalism of its own, where there's this kind of market fundamentalism. Absolutely everything about life has to be reduced to creating a market and the exercise of choice, which is all about, choice. Really, what we mean by that is the expression of individual freedom, which means that freedom for the rich and the strong is quite often oppression for the poor and the weak, and exploitation for the poor and the weak. It also fails to take into account the fact that actually we have other values that matter to us, especially when it comes to things like the delivery of important public services. So we don't say, when it comes to health or education or even things like public transport, that individual choice and freedom is the preeminent value. We say that other values matter to us too, like solidarity and justice and fairness, and sometimes even a principle of equality, which is why we have a health service structured in the way that we do, which is why we have a largely comprehensive education system. And the net effect of this sort of ultraliberalism of right and left is that, you know, you might have a left-wing government that does a bit of cultural liberalism and Then you might have a right-wing government that might not like what they've inherited very much, but they very rarely repeal it. They just proceed with their own liberalising agendas. And this keeps happening stage by stage on left and right. And you have this kind of ratchet effect. And the end effect is a society that is quite atomised, with individuals quite isolated, lacking in the sort of community relationships that people actually value and have been important through time. Communities that have lost a lot of economic opportunity, and with that, a lot of civic self-confidence. And perversely, for people on the right, quite often you end up with actually a larger state, because the state ends up trying to pick up the pieces of some of those economic and social failures.
A lot of people would probably like to know, given that we had the budget yesterday and thinking about the topics you've picked up on, how do you assess our current government against this criteria that you've laid out? We see, for example, there are parallels with your own book, where we see the government spending more on things like defence, infrastructure, and health and so forth. But at the same time, are they following perhaps this direction that you want them to follow and you set out for them in your book? Or is it something a little bit almost there but not quite?
Yeah, it's much messier than that. And the context to all of this is this sort of electoral realignment that is taking place, not just in Britain, but actually across the West, where obviously traditionally Conservative voters would have been more likely to be prosperous, better educated, in professional jobs, and therefore quite often live in cities as well as the country and so on. And the left obviously drew their support mainly through working class voters. What is happening in Britain and in other Western countries, whether that's America, Australia, parts of Europe, is the left is repelling a lot of its traditional support. Because the left is picking up policies and messages connected to this kind of cultural liberalism that I just mentioned, they give every appearance to a lot of working class voters of being unpatriotic, caring little about community and family and responsibility. And they're driving a lot of that traditional support away. And by showing a commitment to patriotism and associated values and interests, values and issues, the Conservatives are picking up some of that support. So now you're seeing the Conservatives' core vote becoming less educated, less prosperous than probably ever before, more provincial, more likely to be in towns and suburbs, and the Labour core vote becoming much more ethnically diverse, much more likely to be in the public sector, and is much more likely to be in like densely urban areas, inner cities, and also university towns. So this stuff is actually happening for quite deep structural, economic, social, intellectual reasons. And whether the Tories like it or not, and to be honest, some of them don't, because I think some of them would rather prefer their old electoral coalition, partly, to be honest, for reasons of snobbery. Partly because the new voters are a little bit embarrassing. They're very direct. They talk about things like immigration and things that make us feel very embarrassed. But also because these voters are less economically secure. So they are going to be more demanding of the state than the traditional Tory electoral coalition. So certain Tories actually don't like this change, even though I think it actually presents quite a significant opportunity for the party to genuinely govern something resembling the whole country rather than a sort of prosperous rump in the south. And I think the Conservative Party would be better for being a geographically sort of one country and cross-class party. I think it would be a better governing vehicle for those things. And so regardless of whether the politicians and the strategists are doing this out of reasons of conviction or not, they now know that their new electoral coalition requires different things of them. It was the old Red Wall constituencies that gave Boris the big majority. I recently wrote a Daily Telegraph column where I said the party faces a big choice about whether it goes back to being the party of the respectables, the people the MPs who might still get their dinner party invitations in North and West London by talking about climate change and international aid and that kind of thing? Or do they become the party of the dependables, party who, that's trusted by working class provincial voters to be on their side and look after their interests. And I think, what we've seen this week is Rishi, I think, is very mindful of this new coalition of voters and understands that you can hardly say, oh, we're not going to invest in your communities, because while we did promise that at the election, events have rather changed because of the fiscal crisis caused by the pandemic, only to continue to spend 0.7% of GDP on international aid, for example. But I think it would be a mistake to conclude that the party is completely there, it is completely reconciled to this kind of shift, because I think, to be honest, there's a sort of state of struggle at the moment. Some people get it, some people don't get it, some people think they get it but don't, some people like it, some people oppose it, and for some people it's challenging to their ideology, because they want to get back to cutting spending and shrinking the state and that kind of thing, which is not compatible with the new voters.
Looking across the aisle, it seems that it's not only the Conservatives who have this problem of this new coalition, this new consensus building, this new alliance building in terms of how do you get that golden number where you get your party across the line and into government. Keir Starmer at the moment is going through a huge headache, and Labour internally seem to have major problems where they cannot reconcile their own divisions between those who look at the red wall and look at the loss of those seats in the red wall and go, something needs to change there, and the more ideological part of the party, which is much closer to the base, closer to that kind of Corbynist spring. Have you looked much at what's going on in Labour, and where do you see Keir Starmer's Labour Party going when it comes to reaching out in this new situation?
Well, so Labour are in big trouble. People understandably focus on the situation the government's in at the moment, and they look at Labour with Keir Starmer as much more respectable, competent, fluent, and so on, and think that Labour are in a much better place. They obviously are in a better place than under Jeremy Corbyn, but they've still got some big problems. Scotland is still a big problem for them. It is still dominated by the SNP. They are caught strategically between flirting with the idea of accepting a future referendum, accepting potentially the SNP and coalition with them in Westminster, showing a bit of ankle to the voters they've lost to the SNP, and staying true to their sort of unionist tradition in Scotland. And so they're sort of squeezed between the SNP and the Tories in Scotland in many ways. This may change because of the way people in Scotland have felt about the Tories very recently, but the Tories are undoubtedly the purist unionist party. So if you really care about the union, you're going to vote Tory. It's not really clear why you would necessarily vote Labour as opposed to voting for the SNP. So they're squeezed horribly in Scotland. Without Scotland, Labour are in a really deep structural problem, because Labour have not won a plurality of the vote in England since 2001. So the second Blair election, they won a plurality of the vote. But even with Blair in 2005, Michael Howard won more votes in England than Labour. And it's obviously got worse for them since then as well, because they've gone backwards in Wales. And at the last election, they lost the red wall too. So Starmer has to work out how on earth he puts back together an electoral coalition that could potentially take him to victory, or at least to a hung parliament where he might be able to do deals with others. And that is very difficult. But what he realises, I think, and he's appointed some very good advisors, one of whom in particular, I think, is very good, called Claire Ainsley, who used to run the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and wrote an interesting book called The New Working Class. He understands that he can potentially build a bridge between his existing votes, which you might say in shorthand is Islington, and the vote he needs to win back, which is like in shorthand Workington. He can build a bridge between those places if his promise is about more interventionist policy, more redistribution through the tax system and so on. If it is about cultural issues, he doesn't stand a chance, because the voters of Workington on cultural issues do not agree with the kind of Labour core vote and activist base in Islington and elsewhere. So his strategy is to try to shut down cultural issues as far as possible, whether it's believable or not. Talk a good game about things like family and responsibility and patriotism, but mainly to focus on socioeconomic issues, to not say anything about policy, because policy, he doesn't need to talk about policy, and policy inevitably causes arguments and division because it reveals choices, and to attack the government on competence. And that is what he hopes might take him, at least part of the way or a long way towards winning. And it's obviously done him some good so far, because he's made up quite a bit of ground since taking over from Corbyn. My feeling is that cultural issues are very difficult to just keep quiet. Firstly, the Tories will know that it's a great wedge issue. And so, I wouldn't be altogether surprised if by the time of the next election, the Tories are talking about abolishing the Human Rights Act, or something to do with the European Convention on Human Rights, or certainly strong things on law and order and immigration. But also, it's not just a question of, can Starmer resist compromising with his party, who wants him to be more sort of radical on sort of left liberalism. I think the struggle's actually within him, because I think he actually does believe a lot of this stuff. Hence, he took the knee for Black Lives Matter. Hence, he has already promised to change the Gender Recognition Act. So even though he knows that strategically he should, shut up on cultural issues, he hasn't actually been able to so far. And I think that is the predicament that Labour have at the moment.
Moving on to the sort of international situation in terms of where Britain is, a lot of people will be wondering whether you have any sort of concerns with the upcoming EU-UK trade deal that we should be a few weeks away from signing. Do you have any sort of reservations about the deal going forward?
Well, my expectation is that there will be a deal. It will be a deal that Remainers and people who back a so-called soft Brexit, I don't accept that language, but a so-called soft Brexit, will not like, because they will consider it too thin, not ambitious. It doesn't reflect the extent to which our economies are integrated. And if there is a deal, and it is along these lines, I think that will be acceptable to Leave voters like me, to most Eurosceptic Tory MPs and members, and so on. Because if it is that kind of deal, it's not going to mean ongoing jurisdiction for the European Court of Justice. It's not going to mean membership of any of the European institutions. It doesn't mean that Britain is in any way a rule taker. It will mean that we have proper autonomy over our legal and regulatory future. And there are obviously areas where there needs to be compromise in terms of level playing ground provisions, fisheries, and so on. I mean, it's important for, I think, Eurosceptics who are very suspicious of whatever deal is struck to remember that any trade deal has provisions to, at the very least, cooperate on regulatory issues, advanced warning systems and things like that, to make sure that there isn't kind of what might be said to be the wrong kind of competition. But if those things aren't possible, then it remains the government's position that they will walk away. But my view is, if that is what happens, it will be because ultimately the EU has not been prepared to accept that Britain outside the EU is genuinely an independent and sovereign country. It will be because they are trying to impose ongoing control of our legal and regulatory frameworks, that they're trying to impose ongoing judicial oversight that isn't a kind of neutral legal mechanism, but is its own court system, which is obviously not appropriate. It would be entirely one-sided, and I think completely unprecedented for a trade deal anywhere in the world. So I'm sure, just as with the first stage agreement, that Britain is ready to compromise in different ways. In fact, Britain already has compromised in certain ways. If there isn't a deal, I would think that the responsibility lies in Brussels and not in London.
In terms of other partners internationally, two countries that have been very easy to work with for the United Kingdom have been Israel, who were one of the first countries we agreed, I think, to a framework for an continuity agreement in terms of trade, and also Japan. Why is it that countries such as Israel and Japan seem to have a better relationship and a closer understanding of the UK's position, as opposed to some of the other countries that we are negotiating continuing free trade agreements with?
Do you mean, I don't know which countries you mean in terms of those who might be more awkward or less positive?
So I think, for example, Turkey, we had quite a lot of progress in terms of our negotiations with Turkey, but one of the things that was not quite agreed was the issue of agriculture, for example. But the countries that we signed free trade agreements with first were actually those that we see as quite strong independent nation states. And I'm wondering if there is perhaps some parallel in terms of where we want to go after we leave the European Union with these two countries in particular, because of their quite distinct national identity.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot to say about that. I mean, the first thing is, I'm much older than I'm sure literally anybody on this call. I'm 40, and we haven't had an independent trade policy in my entire lifetime. Right? I mean, we joined the European Union or the European Economic Community as it was in 1973. And from that point, we haven't had our own trade policy, which means that actually, firstly, the British state needs to acquire more experience and expertise, which it is building up right now. But it also means that actually the politics of trade are quite unfamiliar to us. We sort of, I think, quite complacently think, well, we're a country that's very much committed to free trade, which is true to a point. When we come to negotiate something more than the rollover trade agreements that have been agreed so far, which might involve significant liberalisation of trade when it comes to agricultural produce. We'll see how truly committed a lot of Tory MPs representing big rural constituencies with significant agricultural interests will be. How committed to free trade will they be in those circumstances? And I think agriculture is one of those that's actually quite difficult in the politics of those talks. But of course, it's not always just trade and trading issues that affect trade agreements. So, Japan has a very strong interest in Britain becoming a significant player in the Pacific. In many ways, Japan is actually a country that's quite similar to Britain in that it's a significant island economy. Out of the EU, we will both be sort of independent, mid to large countries, not big in the sense of the United States or China now and in the future, but powerful and important. They are very concerned about the role of China in the Pacific, and they see Britain as the kind of country that will be important in while working with other countries, obviously, in potentially trying to counter some of China's ambitions, whether that's because of our role in the Security Council, whether it's because of our status as a nuclear power, a country with military capability. And they know that Britain has an interest in becoming more of a player in a trading sense in the Pacific. There's going to be a lot of growth in the Indo-Pacific region. And they think that they may be able to get a little bit more than trade out of us. They'll be able to get diplomatic heft, geopolitical support, and so on. So there's quite a good reason for Japan to be quite constructive trading negotiators. I mean, I'd say there's probably a fairly similar story with Israel in the sense that Israel wants to develop closer relationships with other democratic countries in all sorts of ways. In fact, I think Israeli diplomats always want to try to get people to think about Israel in terms of more than just the security player, because that's how people think of it, because that's how it's normally in the news. And so, firstly, actually, there's probably unprecedented coordination on security and defence matters now, where there have been, I think, sort of joint RAF and Israeli Air Force patrols and things like that, which and exercises, which I don't think had happened until very recently. But Israel is an incredibly dynamic economy with brilliant cyber and IT industries, pharmaceuticals, medical research too, brilliant scientific base, and that makes them actually a fairly self-confident trading negotiator, despite the small size of the country. With a country like Turkey, I'll stop after I say this about Turkey. I've gone on a while. It's pretty complicated with Turkey, because of some of the geopolitical issues of the Eastern Mediterranean that are going on right now, but also the relationship with Turkey is very dependent on the future relationship of the EU, because Turkey is in a customs union with the European Union. So how the kind of deal we have with Turkey in the future will depend a little bit on the terms that we have with the EU in the future. And actually, it is a good reminder that we had a very narrow escape when Parliament came very close to imposing a customs union on Britain as the means of delivering Brexit. Because Turkey's in a customs union with the EU without being a member of the EU, what happens is the EU negotiates with third countries access to the Turkish market without winning any kind of quid pro quo for Turkish exporters, because obviously the quid pro quo the EU seeks is for its own members. If that had happened with Britain getting a customs union with the EU, we'd have suffered the same fate.
I'm going to move on to some questions from our audience. We have Dr. Edward Weech has written, what are the intellectual influences of the modern conservative leadership as you see it? They don't seem to be animated by the values of Burke, Coleridge, Hayek, and so on, that we would normally associate with philosophical conservatism. What do you think are Rishi Sunak's and Boris Johnson's ideological basis? Do you think they have intellectuals who they're looking at, or are they more sort of following things in that classical British tradition of just muddling along in office?
Well, I mean, I should obviously start it by saying my book is obviously a big intellectual influence on all of them. I think there are intellectual influences on most members of the cabinet, but I think how directly they are influenced depends on the individual. So it's my view, and I think it's one of the premises of my book actually, that philosophy and intellectual content matters a great deal and much more than people realise. Not because every cabinet minister has read every page of Burke and Oakeshott, or like Margaret Thatcher, carries Hayek around with her and says, "This is what we believe." Not for those reasons. Although, there are undoubtedly some ministers who have read them all and are influenced by those arguments. Some ministers, Jesse Norman has written books about some of these thinkers. So some of them are like that. Lots of them, I think, are actually just influenced by the kind of intellectual climate that is set by thinkers like that. And and this is true of politicians and actually all of us, I think, to some degree, because if you take the kind of left liberalism I was describing earlier, in the book I trace its origins back to the French postmodernists and Michel Foucault, and the way some of those ideas then jumped across the Atlantic to some of the sort of identity politics sort of writers like Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with the theory of intersectionality, and Judith Butler and people like that. Now, clearly, not very many people have read Michel Foucault or carry around with them Judith Butler's latest tract. No, I hope they don't. They'd be pretty sick individuals if they did. But those ideas seep into the consciousness of politicians eventually. Partly, maybe because they were important on campus when those ministers were students, but also because it kind of creates an intellectual climate. So, when you hear people now talking about lived experience, or if they say, well, speaking as a woman, or speaking as a gay man, or whatever, which frankly is a device that says my argument has more validity because of what I am, regardless of what I say, that is really connected to some of the arguments of discourse theories set out by those postmodernists. This argument that discourse is oppressive and there are narratives that help to keep us down, but we participate in our own oppression because we don't even understand the sort of stories that are being told about us and that we tell about ourselves. This all has an influence on the kind of climate of identity politics that we're experiencing today. Hardly any of these people will have read those tracts. So I think it is true that that the sort of intellectual climate that they set influences politicians. Now, could I say who is Boris's or Rishi's sort of primary intellectual influence? Well, no, I'm not sure they could either. But I mean, you can characterize their general political beliefs. I think, despite everything, Rishi is actually much more of a kind of orthodox conservative economic thinker than most people realise, for example.
We have a question from Sarah in Durham. She says, "Thank you for the address. My question relates to the UK-US relations post-Brexit. What can the UK do to keep the special relationship alive under a president seen as less than favourable to Brexit?" I think she means President Biden. And do you think the Trump-May, Trump-Johnson eras were a unique time for US-UK relations?
I hope they were unique, because it's pretty stressful dealing with Donald Trump because he's so unpredictable and so transactional. And while he talked a good game in terms of being supportive of Brexit, I never really trusted him to actually be a good friend of Britain, because I don't think he ever put any other country or any other country's interests sort of anywhere near his own. And I do mean his own, I don't necessarily mean America's. So, while I sort of don't instinctively, as a conservative, I don't instinctively warm to the Democrats, I have no sorrow that the Trumps are arranging their removal van. But I think it's quite an interesting question about the special relationship. I'm trying to avoid using the phrase special relationship because I don't really believe in it. We do have a very close relationship with America, and that relationship is based on common language. Although I think it was Churchill who said we were separated by a common language because they can't really speak English. It's based on things like a common language. That language is a gateway into quite a lot of shared culture. We are, I think, one another's biggest investment partners. British companies actually invest an awful lot in America and are responsible for directly and indirectly an awful lot of American jobs. But actually the bedrock of the relationship is security and military, and in fact more security than military, which is completely invisible to most of the world. But I know quite well, having spent 5 years in the Home Office and some time in Downing Street. And the thing about that is it just goes on regardless of the politicians, because the systems are so entwined. And I think it would take a kind of a real diplomatic eruption and probably the destructive work of consecutive prime ministers and presidents to genuinely really undermine that security relationship. And that's, I think, is actually the way to try to understand the bilateral relationship. So there's a kind of false narrative that presidents and prime ministers kind of have to be ideological bedfellows, because we did have Thatcher and Reagan, and we did have Clinton and Blair, but I think Clinton left office in Blair's first term. There wasn't actually that much over, and actually the most important relationship that Blair had in the White House was with George W. Bush, with whom he didn't really share very much ideologically at all. And the thing that consistently brings prime ministers and presidents together, even if one of them starts off suspicious of the other or skeptical of the relationship, is the need to cooperate on the basis of security and military threats. FDR and Churchill were not ideological bedfellows. Macmillan and JFK the same. It's the international context and the security question that brings us together, and that isn't going to change, I think.
You were one of the first people to write and warn, particularly Britons in the UK, about the encroaching influence of China. You've spoken a little bit about the basis of UK-US relations, that effectively it's based in security. One of the great security threats of our age is this growth of China, this increasing influence of the Chinese government and Chinese security services in our society. How worried should we be at this point?
I think we should be very concerned. The rise of China is, the central fact in this century, and the consequences are enormous. They're enormous in trading terms, and it's easy to forget, I think, that I think some of the economic development and activity of China over the last couple of decades might have made middle and upper class Westerners better off through cheaper produce and frankly the purchase of a lot of Western debt. But it's come at the price of a lot of Western workers being squeezed horrifically. And this is one of the stories of the rise of populism and the political instability in the West. So when Bill Clinton was president, he signed the trade deal with China that effectively took China into the WTO, and he gave a remarkably complacent speech about it, which is available online. It's worth looking up and reading. I think it was to Johns Hopkins University, and he promised that they'd be able to trade more, they'd be able to export more to China without exporting any American jobs at all. Since then, I think it's 60,000 American factories that have closed, and we wonder why the Rust Belt was angry and made very complacent predictions about how freer trade would lead to a freer society and a more peaceful world. Joked about China trying to clamp down on the internet like it was an impossibility. Now they're using the internet to control their society in a way that would have been unimaginable at any point in human history. And I think it's a terrible challenge for the West, because the economic reality means that we can't ignore it. It means that it's very difficult to raise internal human rights abuses, and there is something like a genocide going on, and whatever they say, Belt and Road will have a security component to it. They're setting debt traps for countries all around the world. They're building military infrastructure in all sorts of countries. They've destroyed what Hong Kong was and destroyed the treaty that Hong Kong's freedoms rested upon. They're threatening Taiwan. They sank a Vietnamese fishing vessel in disputed waters recently. They're building military installations in the South China Sea. They're a threat. And according to leaked reports, when the Pentagon has wargamed Pacific conflict between America and China, in every scenario, China won. This is pretty serious stuff, and we need to be very alert to the threat. And the threat isn't a distant thing that won't affect us. They are stealing high volumes of intellectual property and industrial secrets from British companies and Western companies as we speak. So we need to get very alive and smart to the danger and start protecting ourselves. And at the very least, that means not allowing them anywhere near our telecommunications infrastructure, but it also means not making ourselves dependent on Chinese investment in our critical national infrastructure, which is only a mechanism for Beijing to exert geopolitical leverage upon us as members of the UN Security Council and other fora.
I'm going to go to another question from another Durham student. Peter Byrne asks, since the first Blair ministry, the Prime Minister's private office has increasingly sought to centralise power. This has been a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't think anybody's ever done it very well. So I'm not sure I could call it either a good thing or a bad thing. There's a kind of paradox to British government in that we are an overly centralised state, and we need to decentralise much. But within the centralised state, the centre itself is incredibly weak, which does not make for good government. And I've seen it from both sides of the fence, where, in the Home Office, I used to liken Downing Street to a sleeping drunk in the corner, where you'd just be getting on with your business and doing what you wanted. And then periodically the drunk would wake up and start shouting, and then you'd pat them on the head, give them a little something, they'd fall asleep again, and then you would go back to doing what you wanted to do before. it is perverse that the Prime Minister has like 100 or so people working for him in number 10, which is a rickety old building with full of nooks and crannies, impossible to get all the staff together properly in one place to work together. Literally built to encourage intrigue and suspicion and a lack of trust and teamwork, where secretaries of state have all these officials, they have all the management information, all the data, all the experts. And you at the centre have nothing. All you really have is the power to promote and sack and embarrass your colleagues. And if you really want to lead, you need to have a better grip at the centre. And I think actually of any Prime Minister in my lifetime, I would say that at some point in his premiership, it certainly wasn't at the start, Blair probably got closest to running an effective number 10. For proper delivery unit and proper accountability mechanisms and so on. But the one thing I would really do, which would definitely be seen as a centralising measure, is I would abolish the Cabinet Office, which seems like a very boring, sort of technocratic place. It's sort of full of secretariats that decide, sort of arguments between departments and things like that. It's actually incredibly powerful precisely because it's deciding arguments between departments and because it has a lot of these kind of coordination functions. And if you ask almost anybody in the Cabinet Office who they think they work for, they do not say the Minister for the Cabinet Office. They think they work for the Cabinet Secretary, who is a civil servant. And that is completely inappropriate. So I would effectively get rid of the Cabinet Office and I would reverse it into number 10 and I would make it the Prime Minister's Department. And I would say whether the politician in charge of it is the Minister for the Prime Minister's Department or whether it's a powerful Deputy Prime Minister. I would say that the Prime Minister needs to do that and then ask that person to really drive through the agenda and use the power of the Cabinet Office in terms of coordinating, bringing people together and so on to make sure that you can really drive through your programme of change. Because without something like that, I don't think a Prime Minister can really do that, however much authority they have, or however big the majority is.
This ties in very much with the theme in your book of liberal technocrats, which is you take, for example, certain groups within society who have a lot of power, a lot of decision-making power, and are supposedly impartial or have no party affiliation, but in fact they are aligned to this liberalism that you've described in the talk before. In abolishing the Cabinet Office, I mean, this is a very radical step in tackling this. And I'm curious as to whether in this new Prime Minister's team that you want to set up, whether there should be a philosopher to speak to the various members of the team and to get them thinking about things more deeply. Roger Scruton, of course, said that philosophers were important at every level of society. And I'm wondering, should we have a state-paid philosopher in number 10?
Well, I don't know about a state-paid philosopher inside the building. I do think philosophy matters much more than most people give it credit. And if you talk to a lot of politicians, especially Tory politicians, they'll sort of think of themselves as practical men and women, quite often from business, who they just want to focus on achieving things and getting things done. But I think, and actually my phrase must have been better than you thought, because you did remember it correctly. I talk about this, the rise of the liberal technocrats, which I think is one of these myths. There are quite a lot of myths around the kind of elite liberalism that I described earlier. I'll go off on one slightly before going back to this point. One of the myths is about the centre. The centre always sounds so reasonable, doesn't it? And it's always taken to mean several different things at once. So on one hand, it means political moderation in the sense that it's the centre point between right and left. So we'll take the good bits of the right and the good bits of the left, and we'll be even better in the centre. That's moderation. It's also taken to mean where moderate public opinion is, which is actually a lie. Because if you look at public opinion, it tends actually to the left on economic and spending issues and to the right on cultural and identity issues, when in fact centre ground politics do the reverse. They tend to be very hawkish on things like the deficit and on state intervention. They're very open borders and that kind of thing on culture and identity. And then the third thing is the centre means ideological liberalism. And it's very convenient that sort of elite liberals want to elide those three different things, because it at once presents their beliefs as in tune with mainstream opinion and very decent and moderate. But it doesn't actually mean any of those things at all. So that's one of the cons. The other con is this liberal technocracy thing, where you often hear this phrase, we're going to take the politics out of something. We'll get somebody independent to work out what needs to be done, and then we'll just do it. So we'll take the politics out of it. And this is nonsense, because actually, what is politics? Politics is the process by which you decide how you balance out the different values and interests of society. You just can't take the politics out of politics. It's inherent, it's there, it's in society. But politics stands for difference, and we live in a very diverse and pluralistic world. Diverse and pluralistic in the actual senses of the word. But what tends to happen is the same members of the sort of elite groups that adhere to this kind of liberal consensus get commissioned to tell politicians what it is that should happen. And the civil service itself becomes fixated on this kind of, Tony Blair used the phrase, I believe in what works. And it's a con, because it is, what works to these technocrats is quite often pre-configured by philosophical assumptions. So if you take what happened with the pandemic, for example, why haven't we done some of the things that South Korea did? Well, it was actually just taken as a given that it was unacceptable for the state to take information like credit card and phone records data to work out how to run a really efficient contact tracing program. It was taken as a given that we couldn't possibly shut down flights from China or Spain or North Italy at the times when the virus was rife in those places. So we literally carried on flying people in from the hottest of hotspots in the world. And then the net result is we lose control of the virus, and we end up having a much greater loss of our civil liberties by being told to stay in our own homes for months on end. The technocrats would say this is sort of evidence-led. This isn't about philosophical choices at all, but it is. It is. And those philosophical choices always have a liberal bias.
I want to finish on a final question from a student. We have absolutely loads, and thank you so much, Nick, for the time. You've been so generous. I think we've overrun slightly. So from Jack Anderton at King's College London, he asks, what role do you think the media plays in government policy? It seems to me that every government tries to ignore the media and play them, but eventually they have to bow.
I think it's quite often, this is actually quite often misunderstood. And it's actually quite often the fault of the media. And I think there's quite a lot to moan about in this question, but I'll try not to as we're overrunning. This is partly about narrative journalism, I think. I once said when I was in government, I naively said to a journalist, I naively referred to him as a news reporter. And he said, my job isn't to report the news. He was really disgusted. I said, well, what is it then? And he said, well, there's thousands and thousands of things going on at any one time in Westminster and Whitehall. My job is to tell a single story so that everyone can understand what's going on in its totality through one story, to create a narrative. I thought, fucking hell, that's really dangerous. I mean, that's a sort of God complex territory almost. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And it sort of takes you into slightly worrying places. And you sort of see, as part of this kind of narrative approach, you see quite strange things. And I remember when the Lisbon Treaty was agreed, which had been highly controversial. And it was agreed in the dying days of the Blair premiership and before Brown took over. And I remember Adam Bolton on Sky talking about it really excitedly. And he wasn't talking at all about what was in the Lisbon Treaty. He literally didn't describe any of its content at all. he was describing it entirely in terms of the politics of the handover from Blair to Brown and what this meant for Brown's first 100 days and things like that. The Lisbon Treaty involved all sorts of very significant transfers of power from Britain to Europe. It wasn't even being reported like that because it wasn't the narrative. I think that's probably the single most important thing to understand about the way government and media interact. And part of that narrative, and part of that politics, politics and government by narrative, is that it is commonly said that, or it's commonly presented that such and such has done something, but they don't really cover what they've done. They cover why they think they've done it. Oh, it's to appeal to this voter. It's to appease this campaign in this newspaper, and so on. And of course, that's a factor in what politicians do, but actually quite often that's not the case at all. Quite often they're just dealing with the issue before them in the way that they best can. Quite often it will be the result of 18 months or 2 years of work behind the scenes that nobody will know, but it will be understood in the political context of that moment. So it's always, I think, a pretty confused thing. And people quite often assume that politicians follow newspapers and newspapers' content is decided by editors and owners. Well, I've now spent, I don't know, more than 3 years writing for the Daily Telegraph, and I can tell you I've never met the owners. I don't know what they think about any of what I've written. And the editor has never asked me to write a particular thing at all. It's up to me what I write. So that is commonly overstated. And I think actually the truth is, especially when people try to understand like the impact of the Sun or the Murdoch press and things like that, 9 times out of 10, the newspapers are following their readers rather than trying to lead them to a particular place. And newspapers do actually research their readers' opinions quite closely in opinion polling and focus groups.
I want to finish on a question from a Newcastle student, if I may. William Hayes.
Northeast bias here. You.
We see my mum grew up in the Northeast, so I've got to be a little bit biased. I'm terribly sorry. So William Hayes asks, do you personally see any key players or key players to be within the government or on the backbenches of the Conservative Party that could carry Britain's political discourse into a more authentically Tory, Disraelian, Scrutonian position? I think that actually opens up a very interesting area, which is, to what extent do we need to bring ideas back into the Conservative Party and into the Conservative movement more generally, perhaps, as well?
Well, I think there's quite a thirst for ideas at the moment, actually, because I think there's an understanding that the party needs to do something different. It can't go back to the politics and economics of austerity because it's just impossible to do that again. Actually, the economic and global fiscal context is different. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect that we won't. The electoral coalition and the parliamentary composition of the Tory party is very different. So I think people understand that something different needs to happen, and they understand, I think, that there are certain principles that they want to apply, but I don't think they've yet fully worked out what the agenda should be and what that might mean in practice. And so I think there's a thirst for ideas at the moment. It's very difficult for governments to renew, or political parties to renew several years into government. It's much easier to do it in the space of opposition. It's not an argument for opposition. Nobody wants to be in opposition. But it is hard to renew while you're in government, which actually makes the kind of intellectual activity outside the party but close to the party, including in universities, really important.
Well, you've been so generous with your time, Nick. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It has been an absolutely fascinating conversation with Nick Timothy. And Nick, please promise us after COVID you will come and visit our students and our various societies at universities, because we have learnt so much just from this conversation. I think there's so much more to talk about. There's so, we need to talk about the various problems of Foucault and others and how they have had a detrimental impact, or perhaps not.
The best starting place is to buy the book for that.
Yes, so please, in all fine bookstores and online, please buy Nick's book, and we thank you for your time this evening. From the Roger Scruton Centre and all our partners, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.